Well, welcome everybody to City Lights. And for those of you online, welcome. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. Just want to take a moment to acknowledge those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So we are delighted tonight to have with us Deborah Taffa, celebrating this amazing new book, Whiskey Tender. It's published by our friends at Harper Collins. And she's going to be in conversation with our very dear friend, Dean Rader. Whiskey Tender is a compelling and mesmerizing account of growing up amidst the complexities of intertribal life, born on a California Yuma reservation and raised in a Navajo territory in New Mexico. Ms. Taffa dives deeply into her family's history, exploring the friction between her native inheritance and mainstream American culture. The reference for tradition is juxtaposed against the backdrop of assimilation. She is a master storyteller, and we are captivated by her writing here at City Lights. We're delighted to be able to host her tonight. She is a citizen of the Quechan Human Nation and Laguna, Pueblo. She hails from the Iowa Writers Workshop and is the director in the MFA Creative Writing Program at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Her writing has appeared in numerous places. And we're talking about the Los Angeles Review of Books, A Public Space, Salon, the Boston Review, Rumpus, amongst others. As mentioned, joining her tonight is our friend Dean Rader. We've had the pleasure of hosting him many times in the past. He's produced numerous wonderful books of poetry. He's the author of Work and Days, winner of the T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize, amongst many others. His writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Kenyon Review, the Rumpus, and many, many other places, Bomb Magazine. Dean is professor in the Department of English and in the Honors College at the University of San Francisco. So we've posted links online for those of you who are watching, and tonight was going to be a signing afterwards, also a Q&A. So wait till I come to you with the microphone for the Q&A before you ask your questions. And for those of you online, just post them in the chat. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Might be working.
Hello, hello.
No. Oh, you did.
Is that?
Okay. It's
I feel like I'm Phil Donahue.
okay. So I think you're saying we're going to start with a short reading. Yes. So I'll just read two short sections before Dean and I prepare to talk. Thank you so much for coming out and being here. When my parents left their wedding reception, Mom was sober. Dad, of course, drove. He sped towards 4th Avenue, the main thoroughfare in Yuma, cutting into the opposite lane on corners, fishtailing with a groom's finesse. Mom grew scared. She hiked up her wedding dress, reached her long leg over his thigh, and stomped the brake with her high-heel shoe. The tires locked up. The car swung wide to the right before spinning them all the way around to the left, showing them the surprised expressions of people in other cars. It was like we were riding on the tilt-a-whirl at the Yuma County Fair, Mom said. The car slammed into the side of a busy downtown bar. The Plymouth's front end was mangled. Steam poured out of the radiator. It was a Sunday afternoon in April 1963, and the day was still light. Afternoon drinkers came flowing out of the bar's smoky interior like rice throwers out of a cathedral in a haze of incense and prayer. Being the eldest of 15 kids had made Mom conspicuous in this small town, and the bar was her father Juan's favorite, so some of the regulars and barflies realized she was a Herrera girl and wanted to know if she was okay. Sirens started up in the distance. A couple of biker chicks helped Mom out of the car, and she stood with them on the sidewalk in front, staring at the damaged headlight and hood. In her hurry to get out, she'd caught the train of her wedding dress in the door, and it had ripped. When she saw the torn fabric, she started crying. She told us, "I could see your dad through the window of the car with his forehead rested on the wheel, and I knew exactly what he was thinking." Dad was from the Yuma reservation across the train tracks and river, and he was worried the town cops were going to book him again. But when the cops pulled up at the accident scene and looked at Mom, plopped on the curb in a puff of white satin, mascara running down her cheeks, they decided to be merciful and let Dad go. Mom said they felt sorry for her because she was a good local Catholic girl who'd married a crazy Indian. When Dad walked in the front door and heard her telling us the story, he laughed and said she was wrong. He said the cops let him go not because they pitied her, but because Mom was beautiful and pretty people got away with shit. He pulled off his black boots and lifted his holy socks onto the coffee table. He put his arm around her and said getting away scot-free on their wedding day was the first sign Mom's charm would work magic in his life, like a lucky rabbit's foot or a powerful tattoo. He reminded Mom how romantic he'd been at their wedding, how he'd refused to let her sisters decorate the car with do-it-yourself flowers because the phony tissue paper looked too common for a woman of her caliber. Instead, he and his brothers had performed a top-secret midnight operation, sneaking into St. Thomas Indian Mission's garden on the reservation, where they cut a bunch of roses to string over the roof of the car. Mom groaned, "Don't brag about stealing from the church." But the two of them laughed, and Dad went in the kitchen to grab a snack. Mom's protestations never fooled me. She loved the memory of the stolen roses, as well as Dad's claim that her beauty swayed the cops. But what made her light up especially was the way he called her his lucky charm. This is how my parents twisted bad things around, seeing the appearances of events in funhouse mirrors, stretching memories tall and pretty when they were really goofy and squat. They knew a story could be told in various ways, and this is how they chose to shape theirs, and how they would teach me to shape mine as well, by molding their wedding day car accident into their first blessing as a couple. Two, the last time I went home to the reservation was for my mother's funeral. My father was driving, and as we crossed the southern Arizona desert, following the transport van that carried her body, I fell into a sandstorm dream. Dust blew, obscuring the highway, and small pebbles pecked the car like hail. I was driving alone in my dream and wanted to keep up with my mother, but the wind blew the sand so thick it darkened the earth, and I had to slow down because the steering wheel pulled through my hands. Though I knew the car might crash into the Badlands, I did not feel afraid. Instead, the sand flying into the headlights mesmerized me, making me forget who I was, where I was, why I started on this journey. There was no transport van with my mother's body before me, just the wind and darkness and a sense of wonder, the same feeling I had in my earliest years when the earth and the elements and the tiniest creatures were miracles. The storm stopped, and I descended from the car. The sun hung high and blazing, and I looked down the highway to spot a lake shimmering on the empty road. Awake, I would have known the water was a mirage, but in my dream, I was thirsty and I walked toward it, still believing with the faith of a child. I grew up in a homeland favored by the Fata Morgana. Long before I understood illusions, I would see Spanish galleons floating over the horizon. For years, many of my ideas about the world were tricks of the environment. "We're here," my father said, waking me. We got out of the car and went to my mother in the transport van. Her eyes had reopened in transit, and she stared at me as if acknowledging that I'd spent a lifetime doubting what I saw. I felt her chastising me with her gaze, as if she were saying I could no longer stay small and invisible as Indian kids are. I was a 50-year-old woman now, and it was time to grow into more than a ghost child in love with and afraid of mirages. Thank you.
That's so good.
Thank you, Dean.
So I have many questions for you about this project, but I wanted to talk about or ask you to talk about some of the decisions that you made in the structure of the book. So one of the things that's really interesting about this project is that the chapters are organized by year, and you kind of move through the decades of your life, from begins when you're what, 5, 4, up until you graduate high school. So there's a couple of really interesting choices that you make. And one is to start it when you do and end it when you do. And then to also organize the book by years. And I was thinking about this. I tend to think of my life in terms of grades. Like I remember what I was doing in 3rd grade or 5th grade, and we're basically the same age. So you and I, like I remember the 1976 year. I remember
The
the
bicentennial.
bicentennial year. You know, we grew up a state apart, but with some interesting overlaps we've discovered. And so I'm curious if you can talk about, as a writer, the writerly decision to sort of organize by years and what that did for you in terms of like circumscribing events, because pretty much every chapter has a kind of theme, or it poses a question, or there's a family issue that you address in order to sort of pose these larger questions, maybe about indigeneity, maybe about your family, maybe about landscape and race and class. So I was just curious if you could talk to us about those decisions.
I mean, you guys imagine that you were tasked with sharing some of the most intimate stories from your family history. So my father, it wasn't common knowledge in our hometown that he had been tried and convicted of manslaughter at the age of 17. He went to state prison in California. He got out when he was 21. He met my mom, and he was like, a hardworking welder who was like a coach to a bunch of kids in our softball leagues, and went to the church and did a lot of things at the school. And, it's kind of a hidden history. And so there are a lot of ethical considerations that you make when you begin to write a memoir. Why, under what circumstances can I reveal this about my dad, or about myself, or about my siblings, or about my family? And I think I held on to the book for a very long time, until I realized that one of the things that was worthwhile in the project was making sure that I tied all of the sort of difficulties and trauma that my family had to sort of governmental policies, hidden American histories that they don't generally teach in schools, because then you kind of are creating an indictment of the US government and the things that they've done to indigenous people. And it wasn't that hard once I started thinking about it, because Indian boarding schools really affected my grandparents. The Major Crimes Act affected my father. My grandma Esther grew up at Laguna, Pueblo, which has one of the largest open pit uranium mines in the entire country. And she died of a very suspicious form of sinus cancer. So when the book initially came together in Iowa, I was trained as an essayist. It was a collection of essays, and every essay had sort of thematic content that was sort of a different type of violence that I had witnessed in my life. So there was a chapter maybe on domestic violence, or environmental violence, or state violence, or, police violence, church violence, so many ways that our bodies are damaged by the lack of caring that there is in this country for people, for small people like my people. And it was going to go to sale like that, actually. It was chosen by Carmen Maria Machado for like a small book award, and they wanted to publish it. And at that time, my agent was like, just stop for a minute, just stop. She said, let's think about this, because I really am starting to see that there's sort of a narrative arc in the book that is your life growing up. And would you consider rewriting it as a memoir? And Dean, at this point, I had been working on the book for 8 years, and everybody thought I was crazy, because they were like, what? Why are you doing this to yourself? And I'm like, well, I have the book as I've written it saved. I have a copy. What does it hurt me if I take 2 or 3 more years to revise it towards a memoir? If I ultimately don't like the memoir, I can revert to the essay collection. And it's never been for me about making a career writing this book. it was so much more important to me than that. You know, it just, I really wanted to overturn a lot of the negative stereotypes about Indigenous people. And I'll just name one, okay? The government treats us legally as if we're wards of the state. We're unable to better ourselves, our own lives. We can't pull ourselves up we can't do it, you know? My father, for better or for worse, really did believe in the American dream when he got out of prison. He was like, you guys can excel in school and you can make something of yourselves and you just have to work hard. America is a meritocracy. You know, this is what he thought. It was the 1970s, the 1980s. And there are a lot of Indigenous books that portray Indigenous people as like, you know, commodity cheese. We're getting handouts. We're poor. We're kind of living on the reservation. We don't move. That was never my experience of my father or his brothers or his sisters. They all went through the Indian Relocation Act. They got jobs in cities. They sacrificed a great deal to kind of push us ahead. My dad was like a garbage man and a mail delivery guy. And like he would have 3 jobs at once. He worked really hard. And I just feel like Native literature needs to move in a direction where there's a grander portrayal. I know so many professional Indigenous women who are lawyers, business owners, professors. We never see them in our literature. We're just not at that point yet. And I really wanted this book to do the grand coming of age that pushed us ahead in terms of the representation that we're seeing on the page.
Well, it certainly does that. I mean, it's really brave of you to sort of rethink the whole project, right? You think you're done, a great author selects it for an award, and you're like, yes, I've made it, but not quite. So you go back and you rethink it. I'm so glad you mentioned the governmental policies, because one of the things I really love about this book, and there are many things I love, is how it's sort of Janus face. So at one point, it's looking inward to sort of tell your story about your coming of age. But on the other hand, it's also really outward looking. Like you mentioned, the Dawes Act, the Indian Rehabilitation Act. You talk about termination policies. You talk about something that I think very few Americans know about is the AICC, the Pan-Indian movement in Chicago in like, 1961, way before AIM had started, before, 6, 7, 8 years before the Alcatraz occupation. You talk about the Hopi Navajo Rehabilitation Act, right? There's all of these, and you talk about John Calhoun, right? I mean, really important figures, really important policies. So one of the things this book does is not only educate us about, Indigenous people living not on the reservation, on a reservation, but not your home reservation, right? So there's like a dislocation effect. So you're living among Navajo, but you're not Navajo.
Exactly.
Right. And it's kind of an Indigenous experience in that you're living among Navajo, but also you're living among Mexican Americans and
a lot of Texas oil field people in Farmington. Yeah.
A lot of people moved to Farmington in the 70s and 80s, right? It was sort of a booming town. And then at the same time, you are talking about the effects that policies had on generations of people that were made 100 years before you. Talk about the ghost dance, right? You talk about termination policies. So I'm curious for you, how you sort of made the choice to link the personal with the political.
Well, it was kind of scary because I didn't know that it would sell that way. So when I wrote it and we sold it, it sold as a memoir, which was a very clear tracking of the childhood narrative, the coming of age, that I had never really seen written. And for the 70s and 80s, there is not a Native memoir that exists in the world that tells of a coming of age in the 70s and 80s.
Correct.
It's just not out there. So it's a cliche to say, but write the book that you don't see on the shelves. So I wrote it and I sold it to my editor at Harper, and she came back to me and she was like, this is pretty done. What do you want to do in the next year? There's not much to do with it. And I told her, I really want to weave in all of the little things that you mentioned right now, which is actually a very comprehensive list. I'm I'm impressed. You should send that list to me because sometimes I try to come up with it in my head and there's so much.
Oh, I've got a list.
And so I told her, I want to do that, but I don't want to digress so far in the direction of history and like government speak that people lose the thread of the kid coming of age, the emotional story of this family. I'm really afraid that it's going to break the narrative arc. And she told me, okay, I'm not going to let you do that. I promise I'll stay your hand. So then I went into research mode. So a lot of times I'll tell people I reverse engineered the book because I didn't start from a vantage point of research. I started by sitting at the feet of my grandpa and my great aunts and my dad and my cousin, and people would tell me stories, and you hear stories in Native America. Why did this happen? Or why did that happen? And they explain to you. But I actually did have to go in and do the research and infuse it with that later in the game. And my editor, she fulfilled her promise to me. She was like, this is too much. Let's trim it back. Or, you don't need all of this. And she helped me stay my hand. I have a friend who told me, you know what you did? You made a cupcake with zucchini in it. And nobody knows that there's zucchini in it. And I'm like, I love that analogy because I was telling people it's kind of a bait and switch. You want it to be like Res Dogs meets the Southwest. Like, there's childhood problems. There's like there's suicide, like childhood suicide attempts. And it's like tragedies, car accidents, all of the drama and tragedy that people feel engaged with, but then you kind of slip into it an education that I think a lot of people in this country lack. And it's unfortunate that we don't know about it. And I mean, one of the nicest things somebody wrote about the book was in saying that it's not an Indigenous memoir. People are calling it an Indigenous, but that it's an American memoir, full stop, that it's about the way our country was birthed and the way that it affects real families. I'm not that young. So my great grandma, who I knew very well, was born in the late 1800s.
Well, one of the things that you do really brilliantly in the book is you tease out, by way of showing, not telling, the ways in which trauma and traumatic experience that you think might be personal or individual or isolated is really a domino effect of a century of traumatic events. And how hard it is for a young girl urged to live in an assimilated culture in a reservation town that is not from her tribe, with different religious experiences. Your father, more conventionally Indigenous, your mother more conventionally Catholic. These competing forces that you think are yours, that's something wrong with you as an individual, but it's layers and layers and layers of institutional and national trauma that is impossible to tease out when you're a kid. And maybe only with the perspective of hindsight can you kind of put these puzzle pieces together. I really haven't read anything like that before.
The thing for me is when you think of Indigenous kids and you see them in their communities and they look at their parents and they look at their grandparents and you see them that they're struggling, it's really easy for you to think, this is because of some moral failure of my family or like a lack of character. Why is this happening? It's only when you get older and you start to understand history, they say, oh, now I understand sort of the invisible societal pressures that were placed on my grandparents and my parents. And that's so incredible when you realize that. I want to make sure that Indigenous kids have access to that story because it offers some levity. It gives you some, a good memoir tells what happened. A great memoir, I think, tells what happened and how that societal pressure kind of affected people. And, some of the things that I hope are universal for readers also are just that we don't always associate Native American people with the story of migration, right? But if you think of the reservation as a sovereign nation that exists, that's a country within a country, we immigrated from our home reservation into mainstream America. And I was a minority Indian in a native majority of Navajo people that they thought I was a stranger and
Right.
an outsider. And so I was always this very liminal kid who was always kind of in between worlds and was always kind of getting into trouble that was way bigger than me. And I'm very hard headed. And I created a lot of problems for myself. But I think that there are all the sort of fiascos and foibles that kids get into when they're young. I was just maybe a little different from my sisters who were like, for them, they really loved the rite of passage of going to Mexico for spring break or going to prom or getting their driver's license. And I was always this kid that was like, I wish we had our old indigenous rites of passage. And like, I was a vegetarian when I was 16. And, you know, I was kind of the weird one that didn't fit in the 1980s, which was kind of the rise of the Trump era. And it was kind of a conservative time period. I would have probably fit in much better in kind of the hippie generation. I was born out of my element. And so I was always pushing back and fighting back against my own family, who they wanted us just to be model minorities, go to school, do really well, go make the family proud. And I was always asking questions and always angry about the school curriculum. And that's what you see play out in the book, I think.
Yeah, I was just thinking as I was reading the book and thinking about, our conversation tonight, how many different worlds you were sort of between growing up. And you must have felt like there was no one like you. No one.
It's so funny though, because now I'm the director of the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And the next generation is very intersectional. So we have students who are like half Hebrew and half Dene, or half Lakota and half Norwegian. And they, I'm like, okay, you guys are of a generation that has an experience that when I was growing up, my father, people like me and my sisters, we were considered what a lot of Navajo people would call breeds. Like you're a half breed. You don't fit in anywhere. And then you don't fit in with the kids, the Mormons or the kids from Texas. It was a very difficult time for me, I think. Yeah.
You write, and I love this quote. I'm going to get it wrong, but you say at one point that you think of the United States as one big reservation. And I love that quote. I wrote it down and I want to sort of talk about it with my students, but I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
I don't know, now we're discovering that. I think I saw the other day that they, because so much of the ice is melting in at the poles, that they can see how many people actually died in the Americas. There are like at the edge of every horizon, there was a town, there was a village. It was very populated North and South America. And to have erased completely the incredible and beautiful cultures that were here on this land. We loved this land and we loved it better than anybody currently loves it. We took care of it. And I think about them a lot, when I'm traveling across the country. It was the thing that ultimately made me feel at peace with my inheritance, was realizing nobody can take that away. Like the presence of my ancestors permeates everything in this country. And it's such a grand shame that the way we teach kids about Indigenous people in school, it always begins at the juncture of the genocide. It's always like, and then there was the long walk, and then there was the Trail of Tears. That's the first thing you learn. What about the grand botanical, astronomical, architectural feats of the Pueblo people at Chaco, or of Chichen Itza or Machu Picchu? I think kids are starting to learn about it more. But when I was in school, I learned nothing about my ancestors. I heard nothing positive until I heard about all of the tragedies. And that weighs so heavily that you look for coping mechanisms. And for me, it really did become like the outdoors. I learned to hike and rock climb, and I spent a lot of time out in nature. And when I looked at the horizon, I always told myself, this land is, it's filled with the spirit of Indigenous people, and I can hold on to that. And like now I look at people and I see, what is the farm to table movement? Why are people so eager to everybody is in the same place. If you go back far enough in anybody's family history, you eventually encounter family members who knew exactly when to go out to collect berries and what kind of berry and where. They knew when to go mushroom hunting. They knew how to trap that animal that they like to eat, right? We all have that connection, that reciprocity with the land somewhere in our lineage. It just so happens that it's more recent in my lineage, and there's this very pronounced break where it was taken from us because of colonization. But in a lot of ways, I see the book as sort of, it's a reclamation of like the beauty that was here. And I'm trying to urge people not to forget that we have that inside of us, that it's there, that we can think about the land in a different way than we currently do, and that we can think about our inheritance as human beings differently than we do. And that's the awakening that my character goes through. I think by the end, there's sort of a joy and a levity at the end of the book, not to create a spoiler, but there is sort of the healing is in that quote that you like so much.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you was how hard. So I always think about this quote. I think it's by Philip Lopate. He's talking about really good, autobiography or memoir. And he says that the memoirist enters into a silent agreement with the reader. And that is, you give me your time and attention and I will give you candor. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you do really well in this book is you give us candor. And I'm wondering how hard it was for you to write about some of the more personally traumatic events, like the suicide attempt. But if in that process, your character, as you just said, comes to this, I think epiphany is too strong because she's so young, but comes to this understanding about her role in the world and the relationship with land and family, kind of gives her mom and dad a break a little bit. So I'm wondering if you could talk about, was that really hard to write about? And like the scene where your uncle and aunt die, or drowned in the back of the car. I mean, that was a heart-wrenching scene. So I was really struck by how brave a lot of the writing was in here. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
I mean, if any of you are writers, one of the grand gifts of writing is that you take something traumatizing that happened to you, and maybe when it happened, use for example a car accident, it transpired in 2 minutes, and then you take a week to draft it into some sort of a scene, and then you let it sit, and then you take a month to redraft it until it really starts to have like a lyric quality and some really beautiful imagery, and it arrives at a meaning that resonates with you. And by the time you're finished, you have spent so much more time writing the scene than you ever did living it. It was just a blip. And then suddenly you've taken this thing that was kind of smelly and you've spun it into something that you look at it. Every time you look at it, you think, oh, it's beautiful. Like, what a beautiful passage I've created, or what a beautiful short story, or what a beautiful essay. It gives me an emotion when I read it. And I think it gives other people a feeling, and it's like, it's a gift, but in doing it, I think a lot of times you feel physically very fatigued. And so, you're kind of, you write something about yourself, and you ultimately, I think we all have some cognitive dissonance about who we are. And I know I lie to myself a lot. So I'll write it and then I let it sit, and then I go back and I think, oh, that's a complete lie. Like I'm dodging the truth, or I'm dodging an aspect of my personality, or I'm blaming somebody and it wasn't completely their fault. And so I think arriving at sort of the psychological understandings of a family is not something that I could personally rush. So I think if I had written a novel, I probably would have written it much faster because there's not as much at stake.
Right.
But for me, it was like, for whatever I'm requiring my family to expose, I have to really put on the page those seminal moments where I was hurt and I had to respond to some sort of failure. I had to figure things out. And if you had told me that some of the things I exposed in the book, if you told me when I was in my 20s that I was gonna be putting them on a national stage for people everywhere to be reading, I would have been like, hell no, I'm not gonna do that. but you reach a certain point where I feel happy with my life, and I love creating art. I like writing, and I wouldn't have let it go if I didn't feel good about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's something about honoring those experiences, right? You have to treat them with authenticity and truth in order for them to actually mean something to you and the readers.
Yeah, you just, the thing is that when the book came out, I didn't know what people from my reservation or my
yeah.
sisters would think. And for those of you who are writing memoir, that's very frightening. It's like, and I think it's been surprising how much appreciation there is that that the honesty is there. Like, you can have disagreements with your siblings over the interpretation of something, but none of them can refute that I got our life and our family on the page in a way that's faithful to the way we were raised and what happened and sort of the major events of our life. And you're always going to have differences with people in terms of like why that happened, or like, how people behaved, maybe possibly. I just had to make sure that I made fun of myself more than I made fun of anybody else.
Right? That's the key. I was also thinking about how many young Indigenous boys and girls, young Indigenous people of any gender, are going to read your book and finally see themselves in the pages. That must make you feel like you've done really important cultural work.
I don't know. It's hard to say, but I do know that everyone knows about this great African-American migration where people, and nobody knows about this huge migration of Native people to urban areas and small towns that took place in the 50s and 60s, And we had this huge shift in population where 90% of Indigenous people lived on their home reservations in the 1950s. And by the 1970s and 80s, it had really flipped. Like 70%
Correct.
of us lived in mainstream America. And that entire generation, I feel like the story for the 1970s and 80s wasn't documented, because if everybody remembers, there was what they called the Native American literary renaissance that followed the success of N. Scott Momaday. He won the Pulitzer Prize, I think it was in 1968. And then the publishing industry published a lot of people from the generation that followed. All of those people are older than me. Leslie Marmon Silko, Paula Gunn Allen, Simon Ortiz, Louise Erdrich, right? There was a grand slew of Native authors, and then it kind of petered out. And you didn't have a lot of prose writers writing about the 1980s or the 1970s. You obviously had Sherman Alexie. It was like the publishing industry had found they still published that older generation, but it wasn't like they were out publishing a lot of people from my generation, Gen X, right? Now we're seeing sort of a second wave where there are a lot of younger writers who are coming out with stories. Their identities are very intersectional. They're wonderful stories about growing up in cities, but we're still missing that sort of middle ground of the generation. And that's unfortunate because, being born and growing up in the 1970s and the 1980s gave me access to a generation. My great grandparents and my grandparents' generation is just older, and they had different experiences than the generation after me.
Correct.
And that was a very profound time in America. And it's a really tragic time to see silenced, because they were right at the edge of the old way of being in the world.
Right.
If you think that Geronimo was captured in, what was it, like 1889, 1888, you were right at the juncture where it was all put down. And it was, reservations were formed. People were shipped off to prisons, the last of the warriors, and it ended. That was right at the juncture where my great grandparents were born. And so their stories are very important to this country. And we haven't had them documented in sort of firsthand account sort of ways because of the way things played out. And it's not enough to say that one region of Native Americans writing is enough to speak for everyone in the country. I don't have anything to do with salmon culture in the Pacific Northwest. I love people from Spokane. I have a lot of friends from Seattle and that region, and they have beautiful stories. They're not my stories. much like Navajo people who are writing their stories are not my stories. We're so diverse as a population that we deserve to have narratives and counter narratives, middle class narratives. We deserve to have way more books on the shelves. And that's what I'm hoping to achieve in my job at IAIA, essentially.
We've done a really good job with this book. So I loved reading it. Maybe we could go to the Q&A, see what the audience has to say.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi.
My question is, I'm really curious about, you mentioned that, it started as the book started as a series of essays, and that you knew it was going to take 2 to 3 years to reform it. What did you start with first in that revision process? And did it take 2 to 3 years?
I think a lot of what it was scene and character development. So I think of essays as having more exposition, and you're allowed to kind of, you're kind of weaving in information in a way that's not artful. When you move to memoir, you create scenes, and then you give some of the information that's being handed to the audience out via dialogue, or you create what I call an unframed sort of argument or indictment, where you show characters embodying it. You write much closer to the body so that you're kind of getting in really close to, I don't know, really visceral details, sensory details of everyday life. And then you're kind of drawing back to do what I call kind of the Whitman-esque move, where you talk about America on a larger scale. And the most difficult thing about affecting that is to not have a tonal shift when you go from writing more in sort of the narrative. We are familiar with it from fiction a lot of times, right? A lot of times when you first start trying to weave in the history parts, you kind of leap to like an academic cadence. And then you're like, now how can I massage that in to the language of the story so that it doesn't feel disruptive or digressive? And how do I just put enough that you don't draw people's attention away? Does that make sense to you? Yeah. And then the other thing I think is character development. You develop your characters' complexities a bit more. You never come into any sort of writing wanting to kind of crown people with halos or just pronounce them as evil. So you're really kind of looking for a mix of ways in which they're competent, wrongheaded, like they're a mixture of all things. And in particular, the person who emerged a lot in that period of rewrite was my mother, who I had thought of as being a very secondary character to my dad. My dad is like this larger than life guy, right? He has broken his nose like 3 times. He's like a really tough looking guy. He's 83 years old now. And I was telling Dean that he took his first college course at 81 years old at Thana Otham University or Community College, which is, Papago, the old Papago tribe. And he takes 1 class a semester. So he's 83 and he just took his 3rd class in Apache history. And so he's like always curious and always engaged. And even in my childhood, he was the guy that like had all of our attention. He was the life of the party. My mom was always kind of grumpy and in the back or, doing her things, making us follow the rules. And when it switched to memoir, I came to such a greater appreciation of my mother. And my love for her just really, she had just passed away too at the beginning of the pandemic. And I was really surprised by how her character developed and how she became such a big part of the book. I never foresaw that happening. I think if you're a writer, you have to commit to writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting many, 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 many times. Insist and insist and insist on making it better. You get to have one debut, make it something you can be proud of.
Anyone else? Well, let's see if there's anyone online asking anything.
Okay.
Any final thoughts?
Anything you want to leave us with?
I think I have talked so much in the last month and a half as a writer. I never envisioned myself ever speaking this much. I like being behind the desk. And so it's been mildly uncomfortable for me, all of this, but I thank you guys for coming. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Deborah.